Hello and welcome to Pat Vare's Garage. On today's episode, we're going to play a little catch-up on our 1961 Rambler Classic with the L67 supercharged Buick V6. Here she is in all her glory, the first time under her own power, up on the trailer to take it down to the DMV to get the VIN inspection that's been due since 2015. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the front suspension. Here you have the front spindle and the backing plate laying there, and it's a little odd setup. It has a trunnion, and I'll try to put an arrow on the bottom and at the top. They have two trunnions on the A-arms. The shock absorber mounts on the lower and is actually part of an integral support system of that lower A-arm. There'll be more on this later. It's a pretty good system if you keep good grease in it. Here's a little better shot of the trunnions, the upper and the lower. It's hard to see in this picture, but the lower one has separated quite a bit and is actually stripped out. Moving right along, we have the front brakes. As you notice, there are no automatic adjusters on Ramblers, at least not this model. This is the same on all four corners. I also had to resource a 1/8 inch larger wheel cylinder because the wheel cylinders for this 1 year only are not available. And yes, I did eventually knock that mud dauber nest off of there. Alright, here we have the finished product. This is with the smaller wheel cylinders. I went back later and had to put the bigger ones on, as these leak like a sieve. Yep, you got it. Because I had to rebuild myself. And what? Is that a mud dauber nest? I swear, it's not there now. Really. Trust me. Here's my solution to the lower shock mount problem. The problem being that at the time, no one was manufacturing the shock because it took a large eyelet on the bottom and also has a special bushing that goes through it. And I believe the torque is around 225 foot-pounds because the shock actually helps hold the lower A-arm together. So, in my reasoning, I had a bunch of steel laying around. I had some chassis tabs and a couple shock tabs. So here's what I came up with. The spacers you see in this last picture are machined from solid billet steel, and they actually get the torque that the shock would normally have. And then the bracket on top is welded across the top of that spacer, and then it bolts through two existing holes, one on each side of the lower A-arm, making a very stiff, strong connection. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the air ride suspension. Here you see the front trunnion. The cone-shaped part on top of the trunnion normally supported the spring between the upper portion of that fender you see above. I simply plated the upper and lower section and attach the lower piece to the cone of the upper trunnion, which threads onto the top of the trunnion, with some 1/4-20 grade 8 stove bolts, as not to damage the bags when fully deflated. This ended up being a great and relatively easy task. The upper mount was the tough part, as the shock tower is double walled and there is no access to the top without pulling the fender off the car, which I did not want to do. So I cut a relief right there by the VIN number on each shock tower and got my fingers back in there where I could get the top mount attached properly. Moving right along, here is the rear air ride mounts and bags. As you can see, there was quite a bit of welding and a lot of fab work to make it all come together. There was an additional 2 metal plates per stack here, one that goes under the spring perch on the car and one that goes over it in the trunk. Here's the view of the rear mounts from the top. In the center of each one, towards the top, I inserted a 1/2 inch brass nipple that made it all the way up through into the trunk where we could put the fittings for the air ride. Here's the view from underneath where you can see the airbags are mounted on the differential. I did this so I'd be able to get everything set in proper alignment before I welded anything to the rear end. In this picture you can also see the triangulated forelink that I installed prior to this and the lower shock mounts. All of this required much welding and much cursing because it's all overhead. Here's a slightly different angle. Also, one bag is removed. Here we have the forward look from the rear end to give you a better idea of how the forelink was actually set up. You see the upper link goes over to the frame where I reinforced it with some plate steel. The blue line you see is the supply line from the tank to the fuel injection. The black line is the return. They do pass close to the upper mount, but not close enough to worry about. The air ride level controller you see there right below that forward lower mount, and then of course the lower bar going straight forward to the cross member that we installed. Up next is the nasty gas tank. Of course, gas tanks aren't available for Rambler Classics, so I had to go with the next best thing, and I was going to put a fuel cell in it. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to put a fuel cell in this Rambler. So I took the tank out and thought I would just clean it out, but it was so far gone there was no way. So I went on a search, and what I found was that you can buy a brand new tank that fits a 53 Chevy and others that is really close to a Rambler tank. Here's the tank in question. It has a separate level indicator, and then it has an in-tank high pressure pump for fuel injection. You can see that by the black and the red wires. Here we have the tank mounted in the car. As you can clearly see, there's a stud out there all by itself where the original single strap went to hold the tank in. I simply slid the tank towards the rear of the car as there was plenty of room to spare. You can see the blue high pressure line going into the filter then leaving. The black return line also comes in there beside it. The wires have not been hooked up in this photo, but you can clearly see the wooden spacers that I placed above the tank so it would have a nice firm mounting surface. This picture shows, looking back under the transmission towards the rear of the car. On the left you can see the blue line coming into the heat shield as it will be close to the exhaust. The black line to the left of that is the return, and it follows the stock fuel line location. The green lines to your right are the two front air lines coming up towards the front of the car. The thin black line above it is wiring going to the rear of the car. And then inside the frame rail again you see a black heater hose that I pushed the main power feed and brake line to the back of the car. The next two pictures show the engine while it was still installed in the donor vehicle, 1998 Buick Ultra. This picture shows the missing fitting that was keeping the car from being driven. This next series of photos basically just show me uninstalling or removing the wiring harness so I can reuse it. It was a fairly arduous task to remove all the wires that weren't needed in the conversion, and I do not have a picture of the finished harness, but it is considerably smaller. Ta-da! Here's the engine ready for trial fitting into the engine bay. Here it is setting in the Rambler with a new big mount I built off of the existing front-wheel drive mount. You can also see the AC compressor in its first iteration, and also the AC bypass pulley to the lower right in the picture. I ended up using two Chevette motor mounts along the sides of the block because I wasn't sure that having a mount on the very front of the block and then all the way at the tail shaft was the smartest way to go about it. So it actually has two mid mounts that support some of the weight. The front is mounted in polyurethane LS1 generic eBay motor mount kit. Here are the installed Chevette motor mounts. Here's a couple pictures of the original engine I intended to use on this project. So what we're looking at is a 4.3 liter 1982 Oldsmobile V6 diesel. I know. People say they're horrible engines, this and that. I've had quite a few of the V8 diesels and never had any problem with them. But with further research, I figured it was going to be really hard to source any extra parts, so if it ever broke down on the highway, I'd probably be stranded with something no one would have parts for. So bang, the next day the Buick shows up, so I figured it was meant to be. Plenty of power, good mileage, dead nut reliable, and then if I wanted to add a trailer hitch later so I could pull a little teardrop camper, I figured, hey, this might be cool. So that's going to conclude this episode of Pat Bear's Garage. I hope you've enjoyed catching up a little bit on the Rambler. I'm going to try to locate some more pictures and go into some more detail on maybe some bracketry that I had to build custom to this rig, and any other little things I can find along the way. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time on Pat Bear's Garage.